Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsis Watched, where this week I watched Bone Tomahawk from 2015. Now, I believe I brought this movie up as being on my list when we talked about True Grit some weeks ago, because this is one of the more modern Western interpretations, Western stories, new original content being made in that genre. And for long-time viewers, you'll know I've been going over a lot of Western stuff. Not because I'm a particular fanatic for it, but just because I find it particularly interesting as an interpretation of both cinema and then sort of American culture and literature in general. It's an interesting paradigm. So I was not really excited to watch this movie because if you've heard of it but never seen it, you probably know it because it has a reputation in general for being very brutal and gruesome. It has been called a Western horror film. I don't really think it is, and apparently the writer and director doesn't think it is either. We'll get into that. But horror is not particularly my cup of tea, usually not because I don't really like it. I just often think it's done very bad and boring and cheaply, and not in the monetary sense, in the cheating reactions kind of way. So this had been on my list for a while, and I hadn't gotten around to it, and I wasn't really ever excited to watch it. But given that it came up in True Grit, I figured I should get around to watching it. And how should I put this? I really, really like the first half of the film, and I really, really dislike the second half of the film. And I'm going to explain that when we get probably towards the end of the video, because I'm going to talk about it in not explicit spoilers, but enough that I should probably segregate that segment. But I'll say that tonally, the major problem there is just that it goes from one tone that I think is really interesting to a different tone that I think is incredibly boring and dull and cheap. I'll leave that as it is for right now and talk about the rest of the movie and the qualities of it, and then we'll get into talking about that when we're all done. So this is a really well-made film, especially for how cheap it is. The alleged budget is $1.8 million. That is tiny money any time in the last 30 years. And especially when you have a lot of notable actors on the cast, in particular, Kurt Russell playing a lead role. I mean, all of the main characters are established actors. Kurt Russell, Patrick Wilson, a little less established in 2015 than he is now, but still pretty established. Matthew Fox, another notable name, and Richard Jenkins, who's been around for ages. And most of them are not the most high-profile actors, but they're not people who are, hurting for work. So to be made for this money, and I'm sure they were working on shoestring budgets, and these actors were probably not taking huge cuts for their work. I'm curious how long it actually took to produce this film, or for them to do all the shooting. But I could see it being done in like 2 weeks, maybe, if they were really efficient. And that could work out with the money, but still very impressive under the circumstances what they did with it. So I guess as long as we're on the topic, we should talk about the actors. I think all the actors put on really good performances. None of them are really, well, I was going to say none of them are really extraordinary. I would say none of them really stick out as fantastic characterizations, fantastic acting performances, but that's not entirely true. There are some scenes where certain actors shine. I think more than anybody else, Matthew Fox's character is probably the most impressive to me. He has the most variety. He plays one of the most engaging characters to me in terms of his character development, and then Well, yeah, we'll get into it. The one of the he exemplifies something that I think a lot of the actors do in this film very well, which is that they tell a lot of story with their physicality and their emotion, both in their faces and their bodies. And I've talked about this before. This is often something that's relegated to solely like close-up facial acting or dialogue delivery. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it usually doesn't encompass the full breadth of human emotion. And it's you're a lot more capable of getting nuance and even contradiction in somebody's behavior and reading them as a character, as a person in, reality, if you can see their entire body. If you can only see their face, you can only go off the tone of their voice and their facial animation. When you get to their full body, you can see, does their face match what their body is doing? Are they trying to hide their physical reactions in some way to certain things that are happening to them or around them, that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of good physical acting going on in this film. It's also that leads into the cinematography, which we'll talk about more. But a lot of this movie is shot in fairly wide shots, fairly static shots, and that there's very little reverse shot done in the film. I think that works very well to its advantage. A good chunk of this film is about seeing the interactions between individuals. And again, let's get into the characterization. The characters themselves are all fairly subdued. Like, they have a lot of personality that they fit certain archetypes, or they show certain archetypical features, especially of Western characters, in various ways. But they are clearly a lot more nuanced than that. There's a lot of reading that goes into what they're saying to each other and how they're performing. The main characters are largely performing to each other. They're masking. There's a lot of performance there that is not matching what their physical being is showing. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. But let's bring it back all the way to the other characters present. I also really like Richard Jenkins' character, both because as a character, he's really likable, and really one of the most nuanced and easy to read characters. But he also just as an actor, puts on a really good performance, and one who shows sort of the most range. Part of that is the nature of the character that he's playing relative to the others. But across the board after that, I think they all do very reasonable jobs. Kurt Russell I've talked about before. I'm not the biggest fan of, but I think this is the kind of role that he's suited to. And it's especially interesting because this came out, I think, the same year that Django Unchained did, which he was also in, where he's also playing, a Western frontiersman type guy. And the sheer contrast actually between those two characters does remind me, he doesn't have a lot of range, but like within the narrow band of performances that he does particularly well, he can express a lot differently within there. So credit to him, bringing that back to my mind, that he does have variety in there. And I think some of that is also related to the direction that's done in both those films. We'll also put a pin in not Django Unchained. I said Django Unchained. I meant Hateful Eight. Is he in Django Unchained as well? I don't know. I don't think so. Anyway, we'll put a pin in that movie because we'll talk about Tarantino again in reference to this movie. Okay, so most of the performances are really good. Oh, also Lily Simmons, who I've seen in a few things but don't really know particularly well. She's a great performance. She's not present in a lot of the film. I don't think that's really a spoiler. She's not present for a good chunk of the film, but when she is on screen, she is also probably one of the standout actors relative to others. She has a very important role to play, both narratively and meta-narratively, that I think is really interesting, and she does a great job for exactly what the performance needs to be like for that character and that the storytelling that she's doing. Okay, so let's talk about the cinematography and stuff. I think the cinematography and the production of this film is done really, really well in many ways. Like I already talked about, a lot of the shots are static. They are relatively far shots or wide shots. They are capturing a lot of natural light. Very few occasions when I can think of that there was any notable non-natural light being used. They use localized, natural shadowing and lighting to the production advantage, and sometimes deliberately to their disadvantage, where I can see like, oh, that's an ugly shot, but it sort of seems to be ugly on purpose. And generally the cinematic production, I think, is done really well. This does have the usual sort of washed out brown-gray look, not aggressively so. It's more, this looks very naturalistic, and actually if you told me they did very little color grading on the film, I'd believe you. It's just that fundamentally speaking, a bunch of dirty guys in brown and gray and white clothes wandering around in a very arid desert is ultimately not the most visually engaging thing. And that does also visually work to their disadvantage on some occasions. It is played up and sometimes missed, depending on the scene, where sometimes they use visual contrast for particularly striking elements, and sometimes it's just some shots are just kind of muddier than they needed to be. I don't know if that was down to editing preference or editing availability, time, that sort of thing. But there's things that are good and things that could be improved in there. It's still not the prettiest, Westerns can really run the gamut as far as color. So some of the ones we've mentioned before have had really good visuals, really beautiful color, and this is not one of them. So up to personal preference and director's artistic intent, but not the most visually engaging. As far as other elements of the production, another really notable thing is they use music incredibly sparingly in this film. There's good probably 20-30 minute sections of this film where there is nothing but the natural sound. Maybe it's doctored in post, but not enough to be notable, where just really getting deeply engaged in the audio sensation that the characters are going through, the sense of silence and nothing being around, and the only noises, the most notable noises that one character actually makes note of in one scene being like, it's just footsteps and breathing. And I think that works to really good effect. I think for the most part, the moments when they do use music are really quite good. Mostly. There's a few exceptions. I won't detail the specifics. As the rest of the production goes, not a lot of there's a few little elements that I didn't realize how low the budget was until after I had finished it. So there's a few little things where I was like, that looked kind of cheap, or like it was done cheaply. In particular, this will wrap everything up. The very first shot of the film is somebody's throat being slit, and in world you could say, oh, that was a really dull blade, but there is an element that, as I'm production oriented in my viewing, always goes to, okay, were they just not doing a great job acting or doing the post-production editing to indicate the way that the movement of the blade was affecting the body? Because it just looks like somebody, you know, sort of runs a blade across the top of somebody's skin and then it starts bleeding. And it's not great. But while we're talking about, let's see, is there anything else I want to talk about before I get into this? I think we're pretty good. Maybe I'll come back around, but I think we're gonna talk about some of the more direct elements. I won't spoil the whole thing. Not that there's a lot to spoil here. I won't spoil the really major plot beats, but I'm gonna start talking about a few elements and the more deep into the production now. So the first shot of the film should have been my first warning, because it stands out as being completely bizarre in the context of everything that's going to happen in the next hour. And it's hard when it's your first shot to, like, as a viewer, to get a judgment of what the movie's going to be like, you know? Do you take that interpretation if the first shot of the film is somebody's throat being slit, like, is this going to be a really gruesome, violent film the whole way through? And then for the next hour, there's almost nothing that's nothing violent or horrifying of note at all, almost at all. And so in retrospect, it's easy to go, that was a warning for me about the problems I'm going to have later in the film. That's not because I think that's a bad shot. It's just so out of tone. And that's what the warning is. That is one bookend for the part of the movie that I like. The other bookend is about halfway through the movie, about an hour in, when there is an argument between characters, and then there is a very, very audible fake sound. It's really aggressive. And I understand why they did it, because they really want to make sure that they get through the audience what just happened when there's limited visual representation for exactly what has happened. You're supposed to interpret it through the sound. But basically the whole movie up to that point has been very careful with its use of audio, whether that's music or its sound effects and stuff like that. And it is so glaringly fake in a movie that up to that point has been very practical, very real feeling, and very immersive, that I literally like groaned out loud of like, oh, come on. Because it was so bad to me. And that was really the sign of when I was gonna stop liking the movie, because what proceeded after that only kind of got worse and worse. So let me talk about the first chunk of the movie and the things that I really like about that. That is where all of this character development that I was referencing before happens. And I really like the story that it starts to tell. The plot is very simple. It's not trying to do a lot of complicated stuff. It's a setup of, a bunch of guys need to go on a rescue mission. It's not particularly complicated. There's some mitigating factors, but they're sort of determined to do it. And what happens for most of that next, the 50 minutes to an hour or so after the inciting incident, is that you see a lot of interaction between these four characters on this journey, and the way they perform towards each other, the way they mask their feelings, the things they talk about and don't talk about, the conflicts between them, and the way that it tells you about the relationship that they've had between each other and the people that they have become as a result of the town that they live in together and their representative roles in that town. When you've got, a cowboy, a sheriff, a deputy, and sort of a businessman type, and you can sort of, by their visual design, you can get an immediate read on them when you first sort of see them. And then you get little trickles of information. And then you see how they interact with the people that they're close to, and then the people in the town, and then with each other. And that starts to illuminate more and more of their history, and their previous interactions, and the tensions between them, and the affections between them, and all these other things. And during this section, I'm really enjoying it because it starts to look very much like a really strong deconstruction of the Western genre, one that is typically about sort of glorious heroes of the West and manifest destiny, and being maybe outnumbered, but still your abilities are so much better than everybody around you that you're sure to win even when there's danger. And this is very much the opposite. Like, from the very beginning, you understand that these are very practical, grounded characters who are grounded in a reality of the time. There's a recognition when they wander out of town that there's a good chance most or all of them will not come back. And that is something that Westerns often do not acknowledge in any context of the adversary that they happen to be up against. So the idea that there are these four men who recognize who each other are, they recognize their own shortcomings, they recognize the shortcomings of others, there's an element of self-preservation, but there's also an element of their own personal values and their personal honor, and a commitment, a sort of social and societal commitment to like do this thing even when it seems like a bad idea. But then when you're isolated with only the four of them, that really illuminates what the story does best, which is sort of take a really close look at the performative masculinity that is all throughout the West, well, all throughout male behavior, throughout history in general, but throughout, especially the 18 and 1900s, the typical American machismo type of thing, even though machismo is not an American word or English word, but that's sort of that performative masculinity that's going on. And that's really what starts to pick away at this idea of the Western as a genre and the tropes and the characters of the West, that, the cowboy with a gun is not the invulnerable character at any time. The sheriff it's not always the shining beacon of goodness, nor the most capable in any regard. Often it's really just a job. And then it gets into their individual performances of how they see each other, and how Jenkins's character, the deputy, is sort of he's the oldest, he's got the least to live for, but also has sort of the least masking that he does. He recognizes, for the most part, his shortcomings and makes those. He doesn't try to hide those from other people, even the people that rely on him. He's doing his best, and he says as much, and sometimes it's a little bit not enough, and there's a lot of consideration that goes into it, but he's sort of the key in that regard towards looking at the other three, and the way the other three are very, in their individual ways, performative of their roles, that the sheriff puts on the sheriff face, the sheriff role, that the businessman or the dandy puts on being sophisticated and capable and always composed, the way the rough and tumble cowboy is actually sort of just stubborn and does stupid stuff that he should know better, and gets himself into trouble and gets other people, you know, into trouble as well as a result. And how all of those tropes, and you know, when you watch westerns like we have in the past and start to look at those literary archetypes and go, why don't these people immediately die, or why don't these people immediately resolve their issues by just talking, or any number of other interpretations of why western stories, when put under a very practical microscope, don't hold up very well very often, because they are, you know, that propagandistic vision that it has very little grounding in reality, that we've talked about before. And so up to that point where I start to I stop liking the film, I was really enjoying how these characters were sort of tearing down the edifice of the Western, how the production of their performances against each other are synthesizing something that just sort of undermines the whole text of the film, the text of the recovery, the retrieval, the revenge story that is otherwise happening in the film. And there's one moment later in the film involving Lily Simmons' character, who's the cowboy's wife, where she says it in no uncertain terms. If you didn't have it up to that point, it becomes very obvious, where she's just like, well, I'm not even going to say it because well, I don't know. Plug your ears for the next 30 seconds if you don't want to hear the spoiler for the line, but she basically says, that's the problem with frontier living. It's full of idiots. And it really puts it in just a stark contrast there of like, yeah, all these dudes are dumb and they shouldn't have come to do this. And now all bad things are going to happen to all of them because they didn't think this through. So that's like, that all synthesizes into a really neat story about unpacking the mythology of the Western and undoing some of that sort of mythos and the masculinity and that ideology that's attached to it. The problem is we have the second half of the film where we come back to what I started this video talking about, which is that this film is known for being gruesome and grotesque, at least in a couple of occasions. And the content that most people end up remembering this movie for, at least from the pop culture memory of this that I have perceived, is basically that. And that's a shame, because I think it's the most worthless part of the film. The more or less the second half, but mostly the last third of the film, comes down to a final set of confrontations with the enemy that they've gone to meet. And I was really hopeful, because at the beginning of the film it's framed as like, this is a borderline mythological entity that you're going up against. It's like, it's mythologized, and there's a whole bunch of, you know, folklore about what this group is like. I don't know if the spoiler dodgers have already left, but I'm trying not to spoil more here. But basically they give a lot of implications, and there's a lot of production value that's put into sort of hiding the humanity, or the making everything seem more supernatural, and the mythology that as the characters we follow understand that they're going up against. And then the actual delivery is just, it's just a bunch of, okay, actual spoilers for another 30 seconds here. It's just a bunch of cannibals in white face paint who do weird body mods and are sort of horribly inhumane. That's all there is. And it's boring. It's boring. And the really grotesque part, and this is where I'm going to talk about some other movie productions, the really grotesque parts, they are going to stick with me because they are visually memorable, but not in a good way. I've talked about this before. When you do something shocking in cinema, or really in any piece of media, you need to have a good reason to, because if you just put something grotesque or incredibly beautiful, either side of the spectrum really, if you just present it with no context and no meaning and no effect on no rippling effect out from when it happens, it's just there for the cheap value that it is. We've talked about this with horror films before. There's lots of horror films that do this, that just, it's the hallmark of the slasher film, really, more than anything else, in the most basic of ways. But there are so many movies that do rely on cheap emotional triggers, whether that's direct emotional triggers of trying to make you cry or laugh, or more indirect ones like shocking you with either a visual or a literal surprise on screen. And so, yes, this movie is going to be memorable for me, as it has been for many others, with like this really one in particular, but a couple really grotesque scenes where the camera does not pan away from some horrible things happening, except it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't do anything. It's not stunning in any other way than it is in the moment. Even the characters themselves witnessing it don't necessarily react. I'm 50-50 on how I feel about their reactions, because the reactions are very subdued, and under the circumstances you could really interpret it two different ways. Because a lot of movies, especially if you were looking at the horror genre, would play up the melodrama of the horror, where the reverse shot of something gruesome happening would be somebody screaming their absolute head off, instead of, doing anything. And this flips the other way, and instead has characters who are just like looking on stunned, which I kind of get. But especially when you focus the camera on it, is the wrong move. If you want me to believe that there's a bunch of characters that are watching something horrible in stunned silence, the best way you can convince me that they are sort of subdued to the moment, whether that's they're actually trying to keep in their reaction, or they genuinely are so shocked by it that they don't know how to react, whatever interpretation you want to take in that moment, it's much more powerful if, instead of making me as the viewer stare at something gruesome, you make me stare at the people reacting to it. Make me look at the subtle reactions of somebody who is witnessing something that is grotesque beyond their understanding. And let me look them in the eye and understand what happened behind camera, in the reverse of the shot. Let me understand. It's cheaper too. It's cheaper for production purposes and all that. And you can do that version of it wrong too. But instead what you got was, you just made me watch something that I feel gross about, that wasn't really that surprising, I guess. but seems to have mainly only been there for shock value and for marketing, probably, because it doesn't really add anything to the characters that we care about or to the enemy. You know, it doesn't intensify our hatred of the opponent or anything like that, and it doesn't make us more sympathetic towards those who are still present. It doesn't do anything, and so don't show it. As with many horror things, the less you show, usually the better. I wish I could remember what else they've watched where I've made those exact points before, but I know that I have multiple times. And so instead it's just like, ew, dude. Like, I guess that's interesting that I've never seen that on screen before, but also, ugh. And now I have to live with having seen that. And it didn't do anything for me even for the movie, let alone in general. Like, it's the only, if I remember that, I'm going to be annoyed. I'm not going to be like impressed at the visual. I'm going to be annoyed that I have to remember it because you used it cheaply and you did something gross and you're making me remember it. So that's where the real shock is. There's a few others that are a little bit less gruesome, but that gets into my problem with their interpretation of the opponent, because the opponent is characterized at the beginning of the film with all the things I talked about before of being sort of beyond understanding, and we see they do a bunch of things that are very like inhumane and like animalistic and gruesome in a lot of other ways, and that makes us believe in a, well, no, it doesn't. That's the problem. I was going to say it makes us believe in their power as an opponent, but it doesn't, because the whole point of the like hour plus that came before was to tell us how these four guys are kind of pathetic and like they're kind of capable and they're doing their best, but they're mostly kind of useless, and they've kind of a little bit doomed themselves by being underprepared and all performing for each other rather than saying, maybe we need to make different decisions here. You know, they're so attached to their cause rather than actually giving any critical thought, that they're, you know, by the time they get to the end, they're like worn out and just sort of sad and pathetic, and you don't really expect them to be super powerful. So you could have had anything at the other end, and the opponent therefore doesn't have to be very much, and they aren't very much. They're not very impressive in a bunch of ways, and all of that mythology, all of that sort of supernaturality that was implied before is undercut and also not expanded upon narratively at all. At least if you want me to believe in the impressiveness of it, I don't know, build on them, at least like have them present so I can be a little bit more. This is going to be a little bit in contrast to what I was just saying about show less, but show more of the enemy. I'm actually here going to talk more in spoilers about what exactly is happening because I think I need to in order to make my next point. So the enemy being this band or small group, very small group of they're referred to as troglodytes. They're like non-verbal, savage native peoples who are doing body modifications and do weird culty stuff. But there's the thing. You never see any of the culty stuff they do. You see like visual elements that tell us that they're doing weird stuff, but it's never explained. It's never implied to be anything. Like the beginning implies that it's actually supernatural when it's clearly not. And there's the element where like the cowboy character digs the whistle out of one guy, and it's like, okay, so that's how you're undoing the spooky instrument playing thing, but then that doesn't explain why the like in a couple of scenes earlier, the guy yelling sounds so bizarrely loud and animalistic that like the only possible explanation, maybe it's just bad mixing. Maybe it wasn't supposed to be that crazy, but because of the mixing or the general production intention or lack of production, it sounds like it can only be explained by sort of supernatural elements. And so instead it's just like, oh, these are just gross cannibals. But then, okay, I had a point here. Let me see if I can recover it. So then all of this culminates in undercutting what that first part of the film really should have done. And to me, the ending of the film should be everybody dies. Because that's what makes sense narratively for what that tone is saying. Where you go from, okay, we got to do the Old West thing of gathering a party to go save my wife, and we're underprepared and undergunned, and we're going to hostile territory, and also the just wandering into the wilderness on its own is incredibly hazardous for a bunch of reasons, and also some of us are injured, and some of us are idiots, and some of us are old and incapable for other reasons. And so everything about what's told during that section, culminating in like the remaining characters, or most of the remaining characters, getting either dying pathetically, which is kind of a funny moment on its own. The one guy just dying when he's like making this big speech. I love that, actually. That's one of my favorite things in the entire film. It's Patrick Wilson, Matthew Fox's character putting on this big show of like, oh, I'll have my last stand. Give me that gun and some dynamite and blah de blah. And then it's like, and then he just fails. And I kind of love that, but that's like one of the last good moments in the film, because then they keep on with the mythologizing, even though the reality should be like, these guys should just be pathetic and faced with some grotesque people, cannibal types who just overpower them because they're better prepared and they live there or whatever. Or if you really want everybody to die, then, have them have a stupid scuffle where some accident happens and like a bunch of people die by accident, or just they're like so dedicated to killing and or surviving that they fight each other to the death, and then everybody dies, and it's just pathetic at the end, which would fall in the narrative of that first segment of the film that I love so much, and fall into the narrative of undoing the mythology of the Western, of the frontiersman, undoing the idea of the American who carves his own path. Like that's what's at stake. And instead you get this pathetic ending where the final guy who you've been watching for this entire film with the busted leg, who should have died 5 different times, and should have especially died, like the most satisfying conclusion is after the moment where he breaks his leg again, which is the sound I was talking about. You should go, oh, the most logical thing to happen here is they work on him, and either he dies immediately, or he dies after, or he manages to survive the surgical procedure and then still dies because he's still an idiot who's just going for revenge and trying to get his wife back, despite the fact he's completely incapable of doing that. But instead, he's the hero, and it's stupid, and it undoes all of the all of the sort of subtextual critique of undoing the Western mythology. And instead you get the most cliche ending where they, again, even there's even a second last stand guy where this time the sheriff is, you know, now dying, and he's like, well, leave it to me, I'll take out the last ones. And then he does. The entire text is like, oh, there's the 3 gunshots of the guy who's about to die killing the last 3. I guess we're fine. And so and the 3 remaining people walking away, and I'm going, this sucks. This is stupid. All of these people should die, or maybe only the wife should survive, because she's like, maybe only the wife, or only the wife and the deputy, Jenkins's character, because they're the only ones who are a little bit reasonable. Because having Patrick Wilson's character make it to the location, let alone be the valiant hero, is a real narrative stretch. And then for him to continue to not only figuratively but literally walk away from that situation. And so my final interpretation of this film is out of spite, because you hear those 3 gunshots and Richard Jenkins gives a coy smile and throws a rock down on the ground, and it's like, oh, everything's going to be okay. And they cut to black. And my spite interpretation of that ending is going to be, oh, except for the 3 of them had no water, no horses. They state at the beginning of the film that they're doing a 5-day horse ride in 3 days, and then they walk a good chunk of it. And it's like, okay, so you're 5 days by horseback from your town, and it's just the 3 of you, and you're like wounded and not provisioned and all these other things. So my spite interpretation of the ending, coming around again, is that they all just die after that. They all just die walking home because they're not prepared. They don't have the resources, they can't do it. Or they didn't kill all of the ones that were present, and they did a bad head count, and the remaining guys came and killed them. Because that's the correct ending. The correct ending is one where the demythologizing continues to the end. Where they say, no, there has to be a comeuppance for the mistakes of these men, and their foolhardiness and their belief in themselves that is based in nothing other than that Western mythology. Finish the demythologizing, So I'm annoyed both in textual and metatextual ways about the way the second half and the very ending of this film go. I don't like it, and the more I'm talking about it, the more frustrated I am with it. I don't like this film. I think it's a shame, because I really like that first half, but knowing what comes after is just, it undoes every bit of goodwill. I don't know. I'm so frustrated. Anyway, thank you for watching all the way to the end of this video if you've made it here. If you like this film or dislike it, my general impression is that people who have seen it like it, or maybe the people who have seen it and don't like it just don't talk about it. But that's what I'm here for, is saying when I do like things and when I don't like things. Let me know your thoughts if you happen to see it, or if you go watch it after listening to part or all of this review, because it's just what a weird movie. It's not good. Anyway, thank you for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'll see you for something not quite so grotesque next time.